So in this video, we're going to talk about Kantian ethics. So like utilitarianism, Kantian ethics is working from some basic principles. But Kantian ethics has different principles than utilitarianism. Utilitarianism has the principle of utility, which we discussed in a previous video. But Kantian ethics has a few principles, and we'll go through two. Kant thinks that these two principles are versions of each other, so they are compatible and, in a sense, the same principle. Whether or not that's the case is debatable, but here we'll propose both of them to give a sense of what Kant thinks is morally important. The first principle is the principle of universalizability, which says that an act is morally acceptable if and only if its maxim is universalizable. So when you have a maxim, it's going to be the principle that you act from. So when we say that a maxim is universalizable, it means that that principle has to be a principle that you can act from in any situation. Basically, if everybody in the world did this, would this maxim still be possible? If it could be possible, then that maxim is universalizable. If it couldn't be possible, then the maxim's not universalizable. So the great example that Kant usually gives is something like this, related to lying. Let's say we lie in order to deceive somebody. So if that's a maxim that we are implementing in our life, we're going to say that in order to deceive somebody, right? That's the principle of action. In order to deceive somebody, we will lie. We'll commit the action of lying. But what if everybody lied? Well, if everybody lied in the whole world all the time, it was just a world of liars, could you then still implement that maxim? Well, the problem, at least as how Kant sees it, is that it would be impossible to deceive anyone in a world full of liars. Because everyone would know everyone else is lying, everyone else is working off of that maxim. And because of that, nobody would trust anybody. And if nobody trusted anybody, nobody could be deceived by anybody. So the principle would not actually work. You couldn't lie to deceive people in a world where everybody was lying to deceive people. You couldn't do it. It would be inconsistent with itself in such a world. So that maxim would not be universalizable. So Kant would say that maxim would be immoral. The second Kantian principle is the principle of humanity, which says always treat a human being, yourself included, as an end and never as a mere means. Always treat a human being, yourself included, as an end and never as a mere means. So for this principle to work, Kant thinks that no matter what your maxim would be, essentially, you would have to consider humans not in the maxim as just tools to be used. Rather, you'd have to treat them as essentially fellow users of tools. That every human being is an end in themselves, and your violation of that then would be immoral. So if you went about your life thinking, if you went about your life selfishly, let's say you're an ethical egoist, then you're treating yourself as an end, but you're treating everyone else as if they're means to your end. You only consider other people in as much as they can help you or hurt you. You can consider that, but that's just a means to your own personal end. That would be inconsistent with the philosophy of treating everyone as an end. If you treat everyone as an end and not as a mere means, then you're following the principle of humanity. So let's try to see what Kantian Ethics says about the trolley problem. So the principle of universalizability would answer the trolley problem like this. They would say, pull the lever or not, but only if your maxim of action can be consistently applied to everyone undergoing the same situation. So in this kind of situation, let's imagine that everybody in this kind of situation decided that their maxim was to rescue everybody, or to rescue the most people, rather. If your maxim is to rescue the most people, and everyone else's maxim is to rescue the most people, does that ever come into conflict? Does that become inconsistent? Well, you might think that there could be a case where somebody is, let's say somebody's trying to pull the lever and you're trying to pull the lever back because you're both trying to save the most people. But actually, if everyone applies the same maxim, then everyone would end up pulling the lever the same way. And it seems like that would, in fact, be a consistent world to try to save the most people. Similarly, if you apply some other maxim, you might get some other result. But Kant would think that as long as your principle in resolving the trolley problem was consistent, then you could be satisfied with pulling the lever, how that principle dictates. So what are some advantages of the principle of universalizability? So first, it supports our thought that those who set out to do evil are acting immorally, even if through sheer chance they manage to do good. So essentially, it takes into account intentions. The maxim contains an intention, right? The maxim of rescuing people, intending to rescue people or intending to deceive people. There's an intention embedded in that. And that's something we typically do intuitively consider when we're considering whether somebody is good or bad. It also justifies the claim that people who live by noble principles are acting morally, even when some unforeseeable accident intervenes and their action brings only bad results. So typically, if somebody is trying to do the best thing and they fail, we don't blame them as immoral. We certainly say it's a tragedy that they failed, but we don't say they were immoral for failing. So like in the trolley problem case, maybe the person attempts to pull the lever to save the 5 people. They're intending to save as many people as possible, but in fact, they fail. The lever gets jammed, and they're not strong enough to pull it, so the 5 people die. Now, we would say that's a tragedy, and we would have to say that they failed, but we wouldn't necessarily say that they morally failed, right? Because they still intended to do the right thing. The principle of universalizability also clearly emphasizes the moral importance of fairness. So, like with the lying example, in a world where people are lying and getting away with it, those people can get unfair advantages. But in a Kantian world where nobody gets to lie and so nobody gets to take unfair advantage, then we have some way of implementing and following a rule of fairness. So just because you're selfish doesn't mean that you can just be selfish. Just because you're a liar doesn't mean you can just be a liar, because those rules wouldn't necessarily be fair to everyone, because everybody, right, all humans are ends in themselves under the Kantian principle. The argument for irrationality of immorality is another advantage. So Kant thinks that immorality is actually irrational, and he basically has the intuition that if you are consistent, then you obey the principle of universalizability, and if you obey the principle of universalizability, then you act morally. So in other words, if you're not moral, then you are not consistent. If that's true, then there's a straightforward account of what the origin of morality is. The origin of morality is just in rationality. When you're being consistent about the rules that you follow, you are being moral. That's just the consequence of being a consistent agent, is that you're a moral agent. So what are some disadvantages of universalizability? So some have pointed out that we can act on universalizable maxims and still do wrong. So an example we can give is, what if the criminal, so what if we can just hypothesize about a hypothetical criminal. They had robbed a bank in order to damage it and put it out of business. If everyone acted in that way, then the thief's goal could be achieved. So, interestingly, this criminal is not acting out of the desire to rob the bank for money. That maxim would not be universalizable, because as soon as the bank went broke, then people couldn't rob the bank for money anymore. So that would be inconsistent in a world where everybody did it. Rather, the criminal is attempting to rob a bank in order to put it out of business. So could in a world where everybody did this, let's imagine some kind of perhaps like a communist world where everyone is trying to create a world without banks. So they're all robbing the banks in order to damage them, and they don't care if they go out of business, because that's part of the goal, is that they go out of business. That world would actually be consistent according to this principle, because the banks going out of business would be a part of the maxim that they're implementing. Whether or not we consider that a disadvantage, we can leave that up to our own ethical intuitions. So let's also look at the second principle, the principle of humanity, and how it answers the trolley problem. So the principle of humanity would say, pull the lever or not, but only if you do not treat any of the victims involved as means to an end. So in this case, interestingly, the principle of humanity wants to value all of those humans. So all 6 humans that are lying on the tracks are an end in themselves. So you shouldn't use any of them to save the others. Now, I suppose you could argue that pulling the lever to save the 5 and sacrificing the 1, you might be able to say, well, you're using that 1 in order to save the 5. And you may be able to construe it like that, but you're not really using them in an essential way. So if there were 5 people lying on the tracks and the other track was empty and you rerouted it, then everything would go fine. The fact that the person's lying there isn't like an essential usage, that isn't essential to saving them. It might be different though. Let's say that in order to save the 5, we throw a person onto the tracks. We push them, and because we push them, they get jammed into the wheels and the trolley stops early, let's say. So in that case, you actually are using the one person as a means to saving the 5. So the verdict on that case might actually be different for the principle of humanity, because you're using a person like that. But in general, because all of them are valuable, a Kantian would acknowledge that in this case that we see in the picture, Kant would acknowledge that whatever you do, you want to do something in which you try to save as many as possible, right? Because all of them do matter, and it's just a tragedy that maybe one of them will have to be sacrificed, but it's not an essential part of the tragedy. So what are some advantages of the principle of humanity? So one advantage is that it directs our attention to respect and dignity as a basis of morality. So because we treat all people equal and all people as ends, this gives every person respect and every person dignity. And that seems to be intuitively part of what we mean when we're being moral. The principle also explains the morality of a fanatic's actions. So a fanatic don't regard human life as infinitely precious. In this case, where a fanatic is somebody who's basically willing to sacrifice others to achieve some ends of their own. A Kantian shouldn't be a fanatic because other people matter too. They have to be considered as part of the aggregate of all ends, right? All of the ends, all of the humans provide ends, and all those ends have to be considered, not just the fanatic's ends. The principle also considers the importance of autonomy. So obviously slavery and rape are immoral because both slavery and rape are using people as a means, not as an ends. The principle also easily explains our outrage with paternalism. Paternalism is a governmental structure where you attempt to remove people's autonomy essentially for their own good, like a parent, an overbearing parent trying to keep their child safe. The principle of humanity, though, would say that these people can't just be treated in any way because these people are ends as well. So they have to be treated as such. The principle also says that our autonomy is what justifies the attitude of never abandoning hope in people. So we're not just suggesting that we're not suggesting that people are automatons. We're suggesting that people have autonomy, that people are capable of good intentions, even when they're capable of bad intentions. The principle also says that many people believe in universal human rights. So because all humans are ends in themselves, we need to have a governmental structure that acknowledges people as ends in themselves, and the way to do that is to afford people certain rights under the law. And those rights have to be universalizable because all humans would have them. And the principle says that our autonomy is what explains our practices of holding each other accountable. So because we're trying to consider people's intentions in their maxims, in their actions, We want to consider their autonomy when we talk about praise and blame of people. So what's a disadvantage of the principle of humanity? The main one that we have here is that the notion of treating someone as an end is vague, and so the principle is difficult to apply. So it does seem like even if we don't treat people as purely means to an end, it does seem like we treat people as means to an end very often. And we don't necessarily always consider this immoral. So when we hire somebody to do a job, let's say, we're hiring them to do something for us. We're treating them as a means. And so it's unclear to what extent treating them as a means is permissible. We don't want to treat them only as a means. That would be an obvious violation of the principle of humanity. But can we treat them as 99% a means and 1% an end? What's the rule here? That's why there's a potential for some vagueness in applications of this rule.